Thanks, Christie. So thank you, panelists, for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about data quality and how vital it is to optimize Gen AI. We have two great panelists. If you were at mid-year, we had a similar session, but our report wasn't finalized. And since then, we finalized the report, and our panelists are here to share the updates and how some of the findings in the report impact in their states of both Alaska and North Carolina. So thank you. So we're going to jump right into the next slide, please. So the report really started on the foundation of, did we think that the adoption of Gen AI would increase the importance of data management? And as you can see by the graph, 95% of the participants said yes, and 5% said no. So it's a great question to kind of kick off the importance of this. I'm going to start with you, Bill, and ask, how do you view the Gen AI investments and the impact on data quality in your state?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I look at this kind of from two different angles. One, obviously, we need to protect our data, and AI tools are extremely effective, but they're also very effective at revealing data if it's not classified properly and categorized properly. And so in order to protect the data, we need to really be paying attention to this. But I think it's also equally important to the success of AI, generative AI tools in general, that we get our arms around and maintain good quality data management, because the success of AI and AI adoption right now is dependent on the perception that people have around it. And so it will only take a few for any organization to have a few missteps with a great AI tool, if the data quality is not there, for people to lose faith in generative AI as a tool, and to really slow down adoption and limit the ability that we might have to take advantage of the incredible tools out there. So I look at it as, we need to protect the data, absolutely. But it's also pretty critical for us to be successful just in AI adoption, by making sure that we don't have those missteps resulting from poor data quality management.
Great, thanks, Bill. You mentioned the AI adoption, and Christie, I know that you're driving a lot of data initiatives in the state of North Carolina. Talk a little bit about how AI adoption is driving data quality, which I think is a good thing, but what are you concerned about, and how might it shape data quality initiatives going forward?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything Bill said, and I agree it is a good thing. And Secretary Weaver said in a recent interview that data is the fuel for generative AI, and it's really what makes the engine go. So if you pull that and continue that analogy, the cleaner and the higher the quality of that fuel, the better the performance. And so this is a huge opportunity. The two different surveys that NASCIO has distributed recently showed that 22% of states have formal data quality programs, and 26% have formal data governance programs. Well, that's an opportunity for growth, right? But that's because, one, funding, implementing, and sustaining these kinds of data management programs is hard, and it's complex, and it requires a lot of close coordination and collaboration and a multi-agency approach. And let's be honest, it's not particularly sexy. But I do think that data quality and these things that in AI are not new. North Carolina's been doing things with AI machine learning for years, but with generative AI and the new conversation, that potential to transform the way we collect data, the way we analyze and generate new data, coupled with this intense interest and press it's receiving, it's really an opportunity. I think in North Carolina, we see it that way as a motivator to really make our case for a more comprehensive data management program.
That's interesting. You mentioned Gen AI. If we jump to the next slide, we can see that in 2024, the state CIO annual survey, NASCIO talked about Gen AI and which business processes they felt would be most relevant to the states. And if we look at the chart, you can see there's several that are in use and several that are being piloted. So from a Gen AI perspective, which will ultimately affect your data quality, which of these are you seeing in your states, and maybe some that aren't even on this list? Christie, I'll start with you, and then Bill, the same question.
Sure, and I think it's important to say that in North Carolina, as in many states, we are taking a risk-based approach while really trying to encourage innovation and innovative ideas and setting up an innovation island to test some of those uses. But yes, we have used generative AI to support coding work, to interpret code that was not well documented. There's a use case that, code was like 40 years old and no one knew what to do with it. We had to move the data to a new system. So we were able to leverage generative AI to do that work. It's really been a great tool that explains complex concepts when you're working with data and coding. And just my disclaimer is no state data has been used in that work. It's really around the code. But that's been a really good use case. And then another one I would say is around procurement. Our procurement office has been working with a vendor partner on intelligent automation over the past year to improve processes and free up really employees from manual tasks. And I think we can all agree in state government that procurement processes always have room for improvement. And so this rollout has been broken into phases. The first 2 phases were completed, and the team estimates that really there was an annual savings around 2,800 person hours, which is significant when you think about the transformation that these kinds of intelligent automations can bring to bear. And then phase 3 will draft content and summarize contracts. So we're really excited about these use cases. There's more we could go on, but I'll have Bill have a chance.
That's great. Hey, Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And, even in a relatively small by population, I'll stipulate, small state like Alaska,
Big in land, big in land.
Big in land, as I always like to remind our friends in Texas. But yeah, we're teeny in terms of state government and population. But even in a relatively small organization like we have, we've documented over a few months ago, and it's grown significantly since then, but over about 300 different use cases that folks are interested in driving towards with the Gen AI tools that we either have access to today or that we expect to have access to shortly. So there's obviously a lot of activity around it. Some areas where I've seen some benefits starting to accrue on the cybersecurity side, not necessarily us generating new Gen AI tools, but leveraging those tools that are starting to appear within our partners' platforms that we use for cybersecurity. So we're starting already to see a lot of benefit pop up in terms of those things that we will, create bespoke solutions for within the state. One of the areas that I'm most excited about that we're getting a lot of interest in, and we're just starting to pilot now, are some various natural language engagement tools. It's one of those things that I think can really, we've used the term democratization of broadband and things like that in the past, but it really will, I think, allow us to democratize IT tools. You won't have to rely on being somewhere in the queue of that IT developer in order to get the results out of a particular system or to engage with a particular data set, if we design these natural language engagement tools appropriately. And then flip side, on the constituent side of the house, I just am really excited about being able to, in plain language, help people get to where they need to get within state government, which can always be a little bit of a challenge sometimes. So that natural language capability we're experimenting with, and I think is going to really be pervasive in our environment.
Great, thanks, Bill. So we realized that data quality is going to be really important because of Gen AI, our first slide. And then we look at some of these really cool use cases that you guys are talking about that drive adoption of Gen AI in your agencies. But now let's talk a little bit about the maturity. And if we go to the next slide, when we look at the report, this was one of the real interesting findings is, do you have a data quality program? As Christie had mentioned, some of the states do and don't. And then how mature is your data quality in your organization and how important is it? So to talk a little bit about, Bill, we'll jump to you and talk a little bit about what's going on from a data maturity perspective and how you're moving up the slide as a result of Gen AI.
Yeah, this is an interesting slide, and I think it does show a little bit of the disconnect between at this point we're rapidly understanding, and we have previously understood the importance, but getting the systemic support behind that takes a little bit of time, and I think that's what we're seeing here. In the case of Alaska, I'll self-declare, we don't have an enterprise-wide data quality program fully in place at this point. Data quality work is ongoing in a number of areas around the state. We're talking about it a lot, and we're making progress in many areas, but it hasn't been formalized as an enterprise-wide system. And I think that's what we're going to see in a number of places where it's really initiative-based. You have a particular AI use case that pops up, it gets support, and in going through that process and moving forward on that use case, you end up having a really good close look at the data that AI tool is using and is manipulating and working with, the fuel for that particular use case. And so it's kind of, initially, I think that we're going to see curated data sets that we spend a lot of attention on, that we make sure are ready for this particular use case. But in parallel, it's highlighted the importance for a comprehensive program to make sure all of our data is clean and efficiently managed and taken care of. And so I think that comprehensive look is starting to kick up, in our case at least, in parallel. But it's going to be a while before that comprehensive look gets all of our data to the point where we can say, okay, we don't need to necessarily have bespoke efforts for individual AI use cases. And I think we need to get that comprehensive look and that enterprise-wide program in place and effective, like a lot of states are really moving forward with. I know, Christie in North Carolina have done some phenomenal things, because AI is going to be pervasive in our environment. AI is not going to be let's go do an AI trick. It's going to be in every single IT system that we operate before very long. Generative AI is. And so I do think that enterprise-wide application of data quality programs is going to be really critical. But in the meantime, we can't hold back AI use cases to wait for the perfect. And that's where I think these curated data sets are really going to kind of help us move forward with specific use cases while we're at the same time working on the enterprise side.
Good, thanks, Bill. So I love Secretary Weaver's comment about fuel, Christie, because it really, when you're talking to policymakers, it's difficult to sometimes talk about technology without putting it in simple terms. And, thinking about the fuel that goes in a car, if fuel is equal to data and the car is the GenAI application, there's all kinds of flavors of fuel. So talk a little bit about the way that you're approaching that in North Carolina, the different ways that data quality programs being formalized.
Sure. And, North Carolina does not yet have a comprehensive data quality program either. And Bill, we agree that it is a goal to have. What we have done in North Carolina is focus in different areas on data quality and data maturity. Our GIS team is the authoritative source of data with our NC1 map, and that data is being used right now for emergency response for Helene, actually pairing that data with our HIE data to locate missing persons. And so by having confidence in the maturity and the quality of that data set, we're able to quickly deploy and do some really cool things with our data. But we can't boil the ocean. I mean, I'm always very cautious about thinking about these big programs because it can be overwhelming, and there's not a one size fits all. And it really, I say it depends a lot when people ask me questions, because it depends on the use case. One data set may seem very benign, but when joined with another, it becomes PII. And so, the approach to focus on specific use cases and curate those data sets, I think, is the right approach for North Carolina, Alaska, and other states as you move towards more comprehensive programs.
Great. So, we keep talking about this data quality maturity. Maybe the next slide coming from the report really starts to break down the maturity into 4 categories. So if you think of these 4 categories, maybe spend a few minutes. Christie, we'll start with you talking about how you're thinking about maturity. I love the idea of incremental and looking at starting small and not trying to boil the ocean. So maybe how do you rate your maturity in North Carolina, and where do you think you're headed to?
It depends, Chris. See, I just said it again. So
I would
put us, between probably most squarely in reactive and moving towards proactive in certain areas. I've already highlighted the work that our GIS teams are doing. But, you know, our longitudinal data service teams looking at longitudinal data from 6 contributing agencies in educational institutions, you know, they have spent more than a year on a really solid data quality program that, you know, I believe can be rolled out, you know, it could actually be more of a whole of state approach. And so, you know, when we're looking at it that way, it's just being coordinating, collaborating, communicating, sharing that information with others so that we can reapply the good work that's happening in different areas.
Okay. Bill, I know we talked a little bit as we were preparing for the call that one of the states actually has incorporated in their enterprise program office some of the work around to mature their processes around that. Talk a little bit about what you're doing in Alaska specifically.
Yeah, I kind of mirror a little bit what Christie indicated. You know, in Alaska, we are also, you know, I think mostly reactive and moving into proactive in some specific areas. One of the areas where we are moving forward in proactively are preparing the state for use of generative AI tools as they are released into our general productivity suite. You know, whether it's Genesis or Copilot or any of the other productivity suite Gen AI tools that the vendors are introducing. You know, there are some things that we need to do to be proactively ready for that. And so we're going through and putting a big push on data classification, on access management, going back and reminding our folks, hey, we need to take a real good look at what people have access to, because when these tools come on and they respect the conditional access rules built into that productivity platform, people might get results based on things that they didn't realize they do have access to. And so those are the types of things that we're proactively looking forward to. We're also identifying training that we need to do and we need to make available to employees generally around use of generative AI, but also specific to the tools that we're going to make available. I do think in terms of those productivity suite tools, we're going to have a little bit of a gradual adoption rate. I think there's a big desire for that. But one of the realities of state government is our funding cycles and our budget cycles are often extended. And many of the things that are coming to fruition and being available this fiscal year, weren't really on the radar you know, in any level of detail when we put our budget for this year together 18 months ago or longer. So there's a funding lag in some of these things that I think will allow us to kind of have a bit of a gradual adoption on some of these AI tools. And so that gives us an opportunity, I think, to get ready for them as we're coming on. But I do like the fact that I think, at least the way I look at it, there's a correlation between the reactive and proactive indications on this slide with exactly what we talked about before. The individual initiatives, the specific initiatives with curated data sets, that really is kind of, in my mind, what we're seeing on the reactive side. The proactive are that enterprise-wide approach and, okay, how do we look at these data sets prior to knowing that there's an AI tool that needs to hit them as part of this specific project? So I do think it is reflective of at least where we're at in the state, and based on what I hear, many other states are as well.
And I just want to piggyback on some of the things that Bill said. I think also when you think about this going between aware, reactive, proactive, managed, you need to look at the different types of data sets, whether it's structured data or unstructured data, and the kinds of tools that, you know, Bill's talking about are really going to be looking at unstructured data when you deploy those kinds of pilots within, you know, our tenants. And so North Carolina is doing very similar things. And I think foundational to that is really just data discovery. And yes, taking a look at your data classification policies and management and making sure that you're covered with all of those data sets. And so that, again, that risk-based approach, but also being able to quickly manage the data or any issues that we find when we do data discovery and look at those things.
That's great, Christie. I think about, we go to the next slide. This is kind of the show me the money slide because, as a former state CIO, I know probably the biggest challenge and hurdle you have is there's never enough money to do all the things that need to be done. And so if we look at this slide, this just kind of reinforces that, right? We have across the top axis, we have kind of low alignment. If you look there in the middle, the darker shades of blue, kind of low alignment of budget with high importance. So let's talk a little bit about how are we dealing with the funding models and the policymakers and getting them to understand the importance of data quality as being the fuel for the car of generative AI car that they want to drive around. So who wants to jump in there first? Christie?
I can go ahead and just
Go
I
ahead,
can go
Bill.
ahead and kick off here just a little bit. You know, first off, I think it is a little bit of a disconnect, but I do think it's kind of to be expected, and it's what we see with kind of emerging technologies as they come up and as they move forward. I also think that, you know, one of the challenges we face is that data quality is one of those things that's kind of under the radar, and it's an ongoing process. And so when we look at funding for kind of emerging technologies, quite often we end up, at least what I've seen, is we get specific use case funding, we get specific application funding, because those are the things where people come in and say, okay, if I buy this, I can get this outcome. And that's kind of where these emerging technologies really start, is a specific outcome that we can get. And so it builds excitement, which is great. But we also, so I think the funding that we're seeing around data quality management initially is going to be built into those initiatives, built into those specific things. Again, getting back to the curated data sets, we're going to be able to build into some of those projects the funding in order to take care of the data for that specific use case. The challenge is going to be, and I think it will follow naturally, that that the enterprise-wide and specific data quality funding will follow, much like overall infrastructure follows. And I use the example when we were talking yesterday. It's kind of like routers versus applications. You know, no one really wants to get excited about and fund, you know, 1,000 routers for your environment. But nothing happens if you don't have those, right? And so, but they do want to fund an application. So when you're putting an application together, if you're going to put it into a particular environment, you might say, well, as part of this project, we need to replace 50 routers. And I think that that's kind of the same model that we're going to be seeing here. Ultimately, data quality is one of those infrastructure level foundational capabilities that we need to be building universally in the environments in the states. And we'll get there, but it's going to be initially driven by some of these really bespoke investments until we can kind of build that infrastructure level of understanding for folks, which I think it will evolve.
Oh, just a follow-up, Bill. So are you envisioning when projects are developed and funded that the requesters of those projects make sure they include data quality, data management attributes in their project forecast and budget?
You know, that's what we're looking for as we start to see some of these come up, is we're asking those questions. Okay, you know, you want this great AI tool. What is the data it's going to be working with? What is the quality of that data? Okay, you probably need to build a little bit into this project in order to care for and curate that data and make sure it's effective. And so, I think that's exactly how we're going to see, at least initially, some of these projects kind of play out. But ultimately, as I said, in parallel, we've got to be looking at the frameworks involved in a statewide program so that we can ultimately raise all ships with that tide.
That's great. You use the word framework. I'm sure that resonates with you, Christie. You want to talk a little bit about what you're doing in North Carolina with the framework and how you're putting more importance on the funding aspects?
Sure. Well, first, North Carolina has enjoyed legislative support and funding for a number of years for the Government Data Analytics Center. And it's just as you described, Bill, funding comes in for very specific analytic use cases. And of course, when we're doing, you know, data onboarding, data quality is baked into that part of that. But being still relatively new in my role, I, you know, chose to take kind of a step back and a step up this year and, you know, invite closer coordination with our privacy and security, enterprise architecture, and agency partners on strategic planning, especially, you know, given everything that's going on with generative AI. And as a result of these strategic planning, you know, conversation initiatives, we're working to stand up what we're calling an enterprise data coordinating council that can unite and have a more coordinated approach, really in a more unified voice to seek funding and support for overarching enterprise data management initiatives, which could be enterprise tools like data catalogs or enterprise training or upskilling employees, because those are things we're going to need to really, as we continue to process data at the speed of which we can do with these generative AI technologies. We're going to need more people, more process, and better tools.
Great. Well, you're a great setup person, Christie. If we jump to the next slide, we really talk about the people side of this, the state employees that are required to execute this. And from the survey, there's a really broad set of roles that fall into this category, and you can see kind of the distribution from data administrators all the way down the list. I won't read all of them, but let's talk a little bit about how you see these roles evolving or changing in your states. Christie, you want to go first?
Sure. And, you know, we have a number of these roles in practice. They may not be classified as that. We've talked about that in our planning call. So one of the things that this enterprise data coordinating council will most likely take on is working with our OSHR, Human Resources Agency, for new classifications. You know, we have a emerging world of data analysis, prompting, all of those really cool things that state governments need to be in the business of doing. And so we'll need to focus on that. But practically speaking, the data division does have data analysts and business analysts and data architects, and that's the work that we're doing day in and day out, working with our state agencies. But there's work to be done to actually make that line up to a classification. A lot of times it's like a square peg in a round hole kind of situation when we're trying to create a new position.
Yep. Bill, how about in Alaska? How is this from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, very similar. We have a lot of these in practice. We have very few of them, honestly, in formal classification. And part of it, I think you're going to see some variance over the various states with the size of government, whether they have bespoke job classes for these or whether it's they're combined based on the number of folks that they have in their IT environment. But the roles are obviously critical. Where I do think we've got some opportunities overall, talking to a lot of our peers in other states. There's a lot of other states doing as we are right now, getting ready to release an updated IT job class family across the state to modernize it, get the language to be more appropriate to the modern environment. I'm not 100% certain that ours is as robust as it needs to be on the data side, just because it's been about 4 years in the making, and this was not as big, not as front of mind. But it is an opportunity for us to get a little more clarity around these things and make sure that we're considering them and we're caring for them appropriately within our workforce, because obviously these are all absolutely critical roles that we need as we're moving forward, and as we get our arms around making sure our data is at the appropriate level for all these modern tools.
Yeah, that's great. That maybe that could be a next NASCIO report, Eric, is IT classifications, and because that does seem to be a constant theme across all the states. Is working through those classifications. So as we look at the report, the report, we'll jump to the next slide, please. The report made a series of recommendations in the way to move forward for the states. It'd be interesting to get the perspective from our two panelists on which of these items are you focused on, or are these the right items? Are there other items that you'd recommend to your peer states that they should consider when they're thinking about data management and data quality? So we'll start with Bill.
Yeah, this is these are all great recommendations, and whenever we get kind of one of these emerging technology thing, and we say, okay, what is the recommended course of actions, or what are the recommended steps to take? It always kind of tickles me, because it really, to use one of Doug's favorite phrases, if you've seen one state, you've seen one state. Well, if you've seen one environment or circumstance, you've seen one, right? And the priority of these recommendations really vary depending on what you're dealing with. That being said, and again, I support all these. In my mind, what's front of mind for me, because we are really laser focused on preparing for those collaborative generative AI tools being introduced to our environment here within the next several months, we're looking hard at data cataloging capabilities, and so we are really looking forward to, and we're looking hard at making sure that we can automate a lot of that and then provide the appropriate review and process and make sure the governance is there so that for all of that data that is in our work productivity platforms, so that when we do introduce those tools, we're not in a catch-up role. So for me, at this very moment, that's one that is really jumping out. But again, it kind of depends on where you're at and what are your imperatives that you're trying to accomplish on which of these you're going to prioritize. But I do think they're all good. But that data cataloging capability, in my mind, is one of those foundational things that we've got to get going for our immediate need, but it's also going to pay dividends downstream.
Right. Good feedback. Christie, how about in North Carolina?
Yeah, I agree. I think these are all, really important, recommendations and things for states to be planning for, having their toolbox. I agree with Bill, having these kinds of tools are critically important. North Carolina, we're focusing in a multi-phase approach. So we're going to look first at data discovery and really looking at an overarching strategy. I talked earlier about working with privacy, security, and enterprise architecture. I mean, my vision would be to make sure these tools are fully interoperable so that when the data is discovered or data for use cases performed a privacy threshold analysis, or we've done a vendor readiness assessment, that all of this data is linked so that we are creating value for our agency partners, so that's more of a one and done, so we can kind of determine impact that way and catalog the data sets that are needed to fuel the use cases. And so it would really be we need to really focus on strategy and planning, and then think about tools that are fully interoperable and support all areas of the agency from a strategic enterprise viewpoint.
Yep. Very good. So I think that's our prepared questions and material for the panelists that went through this exciting report. But I'm sure that, like any webinar, we probably have a few questions. So Eric, I know you've been monitoring the chat for us. Can you come online and share any questions that the audience might have?
Yes, we've got some questions here, and so far they're actually more interested in Gen AI than data management. But here's one for you, Chris and Christie and Bill. So please share what Gen AI tool you have used or built to understand old code. I think you've all been reading about converting COBOL to Python and things like that. So Bill, let's start with you. What tools are you have or considering?
Yeah, so we don't have today a tool in place doing that, working on that function. We're watching closely what a number of states are doing, and we're very interested in that as it develops. And I know Christie's got probably more to share around that. I will tell you, though, in terms of Gen AI tools, again, our situation, we're fairly federated. So the enterprise organization, enterprise IT organization, is looking at enterprise kind of shared services usage. So we've been really focused on, again, we had those over 300 some use cases, aligning those with Gen AI tools that are already existing in our environment. So all of the major cloud providers offer Gen AI tools in their cloud environments. We've got a cloud environment that's pretty robust, and it's already got governance around it to protect the department's data and compute capabilities. And so our intent is to build upon the governance we already have in place, build upon the tools we already have access to see which of those tools can be matched with these particular use cases, and then let the departments and agencies kind of determine how they want to prioritize that and how they want to move forward with those activities and those use cases. That being said, there's a lot of activity going on in our agencies to find specific Gen AI tools to match up with specific use cases that maybe are not appropriate with that general environment. So we don't have one for code yet, but we're watching closely. And Christie, I know you mentioned a little bit of success around there, so I'd be interested to hear what you guys have.
Well, we have a very narrow, limited private instance of ChatGPT for the agency that has been able to do some of that work with the coding. And then we will be implementing Microsoft Copilot soon. And so I think, folks are really excited about the capabilities that will bring to bear. And then a number of our agencies are working with their own vendor partners. And I don't necessarily on this call have purview into all of those, but, there's a lot of focus around chatbots. So it's not just about code. And so there could be different partners or different models out there as well.
Are you looking at the underlying algorithms at all? And we've been concerned about what is in that black box, and are algorithms going to be certified, and how do we certify them, and how do we audit them? Have you thought of that? Bill, let's start with you. Any considerations on, that engine that's ingesting all that data? How good is it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Eric. And we've had a lot of internal kind of water cooler discussions about that very fact. To be honest with you, no, we haven't gone through that process, or we haven't gone down that route. And I think from a practical standpoint, we're really focused on really clearly defining the data that we expose tools to, and then exhaustively testing the tools that we put together. And then making sure that we're making the appropriate risk-based decisions based on whether it's public facing, whether it's internal, whether the information that it is using is public facing or
Right.
internal state data. And we're making those kind of risk-based decisions. Quite frankly, I would love to be able to go in and certify those algorithms. Given the state of generative AI, just my outside looking in, talking to various vendors, I don't think we'd ever launch a thing, because it is so dynamic and it is so moving so quickly.
Okay.
And quite frankly, the OEMs they've got a tiger by the tail in many cases, and so things are changing so rapidly. I think we'd end up getting into paralysis. I do think that the solution is us making sure we control the inputs very closely, making sure we absolutely test the outputs thoroughly, and we make sure that we're very cognizant of those things, and we have the right controls in place. In terms of what's behind the curtain there, I think with the current complexity, it's beyond our reach, and quite frankly, I think it's not something that could easily be done even by some of the OEMs on an ongoing and really in-depth basis. But
A future capability that someone's going to deliver. Be sure about that. Christie, what are your perspectives on that same question?
I completely agree with Bill. I mean, it's just the dynamics of the rapidly changing, it would be hard to stay on top of. That's why I would go back to just having that risk-based framework, right? So have the controls in place, have the governance in place, and really put a lot of that accountability on your vendor partners. Model cards are good to have too, right? But you're really going to be, this is where partnership really becomes very key with your vendor partners as you move into these different models you'll do or tools you'll leverage.
We have a question here from Lisa, and it's related to risk management. So Lisa says, we are giving considerations to a risk-based approach. And in that regard, what about distinguishing between Gen AI to do code generation or code documentation? Are you considering that, or are you actually doing it? Let's start with you, Christie. And maybe you aren't, but that's all right. Would you put it on the radar?
I mean, I think code generation is a great use case for generative AI, and checking code and, changing code to a different format. I mean, it's going to be a huge time saver for work with data when you can, have that AI assistant on your shoulder helping you there. In North Carolina, our framework is all of AI, right? It's not just focused on generative AI. And so, our focus is not really on the code that is generated, but the data that will be leveraged within that code. So we're really focused on how we would be using state data to generate any kind of output, but just generating code in and of itself is, I think, a very good use case for these tools.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Bill?
Yeah, I agree with it with what Christie said. One aspect of code documentation that really is interesting us is, and I'm sure we're alone in state government, but often we have legacy systems where the folks that put them together are no longer in state service. And what we found out during a recent cloud migration project is we had a number of items that we weren't really sure if it was needed, but we were afraid to turn it off because nobody understood how it worked. And we kind of worked through those things, but that's an area where code documentation is something that I'm really interested in. And as we're kind of further moving forward, we can get some good quality documentation and then you know, if that individual is leaving state service or whatever, we've got a great handoff. We've got great continuity within the state, and particularly with a number of bespoke systems. While we still have all those legacy systems, I'm really interested in that code documentation. And I have been talking with a couple other states, and there's one state in particular that I know is working on a pilot program, which is really great. They're documenting code and turning it into plain language description of the function, and then using that plain language to move into code generation, all using AI tools into a modern language. And that to me is one of the golden chalices of AI. Once we get that generative AI model very repeatable and very kind of, you know, transportable, I'm really going to be interested in getting something along those lines, because that's where you start to really leverage, I think, some of the capabilities that we see in these platforms.
You know,
Yeah, I
over
love
the
that.
decades, we have really been lacking documentation. It's like pulling teeth to get
Yeah.
developers sometimes to create the documentation. Like,
Yeah.
oh, brother,
Yeah,
I don't want to do that, you know?
absolutely. Well, and also, you know, for a lot of the right reasons, if you've got an under-resourced environment and you're trying to deliver outcomes to citizens, it's sometimes tough to say, you know what, I'm going to delay developing that next use case that citizens need and they need now, because I'm going to go back and really button up this one. And so I think it's a natural thing. It's not a pejorative, but it is a state of where we're at, and that's an area where I think Gen AI can really help.
Christie, something to add to that?
No, I mean, I
Okay.
agree. And again, documentation isn't fun, right? So let's go on and do the
It's
fun
not fun.
stuff, and we'll get back to that later. So,
Right.
So here's another question for y'all. And this would be very interesting. Consider this notion of a catalog of AI use cases. And what about having something that we could share across the states? I mean, wouldn't that be an interesting idea? Christie, what do you think about that? Do you have
yeah,
a
well,
UK use case catalog?
sure. I think it's a great idea, and I'm sure we would see a lot of similarities, you know, across the states and what we're would like to do, because we, you know, yes, Doug says if you've seen one state, you've seen one state, but we quite honestly have a lot of the same challenges in addressing similar things across our constituent and citizen base. In North Carolina, we are requiring state agencies to create use case inventories with that AI framework, and our AI work group is working with state agencies to kind of document them both at a business justification use case, but also then in our application, our APM tool so that it's, you know, aligned to that whatever they put through the formal EPMO project basis, so in two places.
Yeah.
And I've seen where a number of states are publishing their use cases on their websites, and I think that's something that we would probably move towards as well. So we'll be open to sharing those as they, you know, come into fruition. And many of them are pilots. And then that's the thing about wanting to be innovative, right? So you might want to do a proof of concept or a pilot. It may never come to be, because maybe, you know, it just doesn't show the business value to really have that additional influx of funding, you know, to sustain it for the longer term. But I think pilots, proof of concepts would be worth sharing as well. So then states can learn from each other, so they know that maybe that didn't really turn out so well.
Yeah. Bill, how about you? Up in Alaska.
Yeah, I know. I think I think that'd be a great effort. I know a lot of our conversations as the states get together are around exactly that, and sharing that information, formalizing that information sharing. I think is a really good idea, particularly at this stage of kind of generative AI emerging development, because as I said, I think in a couple of years it's going to be so pervasive that a use case, you know, catalog might not necessarily have a lot of value. It'd be kind of like having a you know, microcomputer use case catalog in the early 90s, late 80s, right? Saying, well, what can you use these things for? Initially, it's really important as you're getting your feet under you and as you're growing the knowledge base. Ultimately, it won't be, but right now, I think it would be very valuable, because a lot of our conversations right now are just the art of the possible with our agencies, saying, hey, these are the types of capabilities that we have our hands on today that we can put together. How does that apply? You know, what are your biggest problems, and how do we see what we can match up and make the connection on? So I think right now that'd be very helpful.
I'm going to modify that question just a little bit, and then I'd like your perspectives on this as well, Chris. What about use cases relative to cybersecurity? Surfacing threats, maybe even responding to threats. Are those in discussion?
Yes,
Or maybe you can't talk about it.
we can't talk about it. We'd have to kill you.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Okay, let's go on. Christie mentioned data discovery, while Bill mentioned data cataloging. Are these similar terms of approach? And if not, what is different? And I'm going to add a little subnote to this. How far along are you with your data catalog? Okay, let's start with you, Christie.
Well, the way we see it, they are different. So I think about, having a tool or set of tools. And so when we talk about data discovery in North Carolina, we're talking about really about, from a security basis,
Okay.
to know where data resides, what level of sensitivity or classification it is. So that in the event of an incident, we can locate it very quickly. And, we're more proactive in that sense. So, and we are going to be moving forward with an RFP around a data discovery and classification tool. Another tool that North Carolina is very interested in is a GRCC tool, right? And so that's another part of, critical part of a proactive data management program. And then data catalog tool is a part of that. And again, you could have one vendor who supplies it all, or it could be a collection of, best of class that are interoperable with each other. But data catalog will really help us with our data lineage and our metadata, and the ability to really empower our users and agencies with use of data. And that's the way I see it.
Bill?
Yeah, and I will defer to Christie. She's the professional in this realm, and so she's
is.
much wiser than me in those areas. And in terms of our maturity, where you're never going to get me to say that we're where we need to be, and we're really on. We've made some progress in the last few years in terms of cataloging our systems and our data contained in our systems.
Yep.
I think we still have a long way to go, like many do, in terms of making sure that is available to folks when and where they need it, and it's also actionable and driving our decisions as we look at our network environment and our entire enterprise environment. But the work it's been recognized as a need, and it's been ongoing for several years, at least here in Alaska, and I know several other states.
Very good. Here's a question from Marcy. I'm curious about how AI can further the notion of interoperability across data systems using different data standards, such as FHIR, NEAM, National Information Exchange Model, things like connecting child welfare and health data, for example. Has anyone been exploring this? Bill, let's start with you. Any idea on how you might be doing this in future, or are you doing this now?
We are piloting something kind of similar on a very small scale. And so
Okay.
What we're starting to develop in a pilot program, again, using tools that are existing in our cloud environment today, we are looking at how we can create that natural language interface for people to ask questions about security policy, high compliance regimes, CGIS, HIPAA, FTI, PII, all these things. They can ask a question and get a synthesized response, natural language. So they don't get a list of policies. They don't get you need to go and look at these 80 different locations. They get a synthesized response. And in my mind, that kind of speaks to the interoperability between the various either systems or for frameworks, et cetera. So very early stages, but I do think that that's a use case that we can really create an effective model for communicating with employees and also citizens about, okay, what is the bottom line? You shouldn't have to know which particular framework is telling you to do what. What is the bottom line about what you want to try to do, and how you can do it safely and in compliance with all of these underlying frameworks? A challenge, and I know something that NASCIO has been working on tirelessly for years, is it's nice if the frameworks somewhat agree in basic areas. They don't necessarily. But I do think this is a particular use case that can provide a lot of value downstream, and it has a lot of extensibility once we start walking down that path.
Very good. Christie, anything to add to that?
Well, yes, we've been doing data integrations for years across different agencies and using standards-based approach to bring those data set together. But I think the example is really more around whole person care. And so one of the examples that will be working towards is a FHIR-based approach, where we will allow our partners at DHHS who are checking citizens' health records so that they can be approved for WIC. It's a critical health check that has to happen, and sometimes that really slows the process down. So we're using FHIR for them to fire off a query to our health information exchange and pull back just those very select clinical data sets so that they can move that person through the application process much more quickly. So yes, we are definitely excited about using those kinds of standards to really to move those kinds of use cases forward. We're also talking with a county government about doing a data integration that would really join together some publicly available criminal justice data and healthcare data to serve some of their to give them some visibility of some of their most vulnerable citizens. And so I'm excited about that as well. And it would also leverage FHIR.
Okay, very good. Here's a statement and then a related question. And you can agree or not agree with this statement, but here's a statement. Bad data quality reflects bad business processes. Okay. Then the question is, how does your data quality program inform business process improvement? Let's start with you, Christie. You got a smile on your face, so I think you might have a response to this.
I mean, yeah, I agree. But we are swimming in data. So let's just be clear, right? State agencies, state government, their best assets is their data and their employees. And so we're swimming in data, and the amount of data that is created on a daily basis, whether that's a citizen keying in something on a website or, tax records coming to us. Can the business processes keep up? Well, I think we all know the answer to that question based on the limited resources that state governments employ.
Yeah.
So, we really have to, again, it goes back to you can't boil the ocean, but you do have to really think about that more circular impact. So if you solve data quality for one use case, how can you then take it back to the point of creation and make sure you've closed that and made it full circle? And I think that's just an ongoing challenge, but I completely agree with whomever made that statement.
Okay. And Bill, your response, please.
I think it's true as far as it goes, but I would vehemently object to the inference that that bad process is because either people aren't doing the right thing or or why there is bad process.
Right.
Because when we look at bad process, it can be driven by a lot of things. It can be driven by technological change that process hasn't caught up with. It can be driven by regulatory demands that require bad process, quite frankly, in order to comply. And so it can be a lot of different things. I do agree, though, that that's the underlying cause in most of this is if you don't have the right process in terms of intake and management of data, then you're going to have bad data. But just if there's an inference that if we just go back and fix our business processes, we're all fine. That's a little simplistic because I do think that bad process is driven by a lot of different factors, some of which we can control, some of which we can't. For instance, like I said, I made a comment, regulatory guidance saying that two organizations in the state government aren't allowed to talk to each other and have to maintain disparate data sets. Well, that creates two silos, which now has the possibility for disconnect and some other things. So that's just a very simplistic example of, bad process might be foisted upon us. And we have to figure out a way to do it. You like that term? So I do agree with the statement, but I think the devil's in the details and underneath.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that we cannot look at data quality management in a vacuum without understanding business process. I think it's got to be an integrated discussion with our business partners around the state, and that's absolutely. From that aspect, I think that's a valuable statement to make so that people understand it is absolutely integral.
Very good, Bill.
Completely agree.
Chris, what are your thoughts on that? Any reaction to that? Anything to add, please?
No, I think our panelists have covered it well. My only reflection is I remember working with a financial services company a decade ago, large bank in the U.S., and they got into this whole debate about who owns the changes to the customer.
Yeah.
And, the example, if someone's married and they have a separate account that their spouse doesn't know about, and all of a sudden you contact them and say, hey, what about this account? Do you want to integrate it with all your other accounts? Like, what account? The spouse that was unknown. So you got to be really careful when you start thinking about who owns the data and who has the responsibility to maintain it. And all that's part of an integrated business process, as you mentioned.
Right.
And another webinar, we talk about privacy, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'll throw out my pitch.
Go ahead.
In Bill's mind, our constituents own the data. We just manage it. And I think that's an important distinction to make in my mind, that we are taking care of data on their behalf, but it's their data.
Right.
And as we look down privacy channels and various other developments, the more that we can put control of where that data is utilized back in the hands of the constituent, and give them that capability, I think is more important. But just in general, it's good for us to remember it's not our data. It's been entrusted to us, and we need to come at it from that perspective.
Very good point.
Mhm.
Thank you all very much for being on this panel, Chris, facilitating this, working with us on this report, all the folks that attended here, Julie for keeping all the technical things working on this webinar. That is the extent of our questions. We're going to have you folks back at some point in future and do another stake in the ground. Well, how far have we come? But for now, thank you so very, very much. And we will close this call.
Thank you for having us.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.